Lecture 9, Mesopotamian and Hebrew Flood Myths.
In our last 6 lectures, we were talking about creation myths, and we looked at many different kinds from many different parts of the world. This time, we want to change the focus slightly to flood myths, which, as we mentioned last time, can be thought of in some ways as adjuncts to creation stories, because the motif that holds them together is water. Many different kinds of creation myths have the original forms of creation emerging out of water, from a deep abyss, or from a void, or from a primal sea. Something stirs it, something happens, and forms and differentiation occur, and creation is underway. Many creation accounts, in fact, picture the cosmos as a sphere, a little bit like those globes that we can get that you tip them upside down, and then when you tip them back up, they snow inside the globe. Many creation accounts picture the cosmos as something like that. Outside of that sphere, which is surrounded by some kind of impervious material, outside of that, there is still the primeval chaos out of which the cosmos was created in the first place. And if the cosmos is thought of as a primal sea, then the globe is entirely surrounded by water. That little sphere is on every side. It's all surrounded by water, all in infinite directions as well. As the the Old Testament says it in its description of the creation story, and God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters," firmament being something like the sky. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. The sky here is a kind of impervious dome that holds out all those surrounding waters. A flood can be created that way, therefore, just by simply cutting a little slit in that dome, and whoosh, we are being inundated by the infinite water again. And water is, as we've mentioned before, is also a vast and formless potential out of which everything emerged. And most early peoples felt that some kind of vigilance, prayer or sacrifice or correct behavior was needed to keep everything from slipping back into that primal deep again. And that's where flood stories come in. Oftentimes, flood stories involve the idea of punishment, and the provenance of flood stories in geographical places that don't even have floods suggests how powerful this idea is. The idea of a chaos which leads to creation, which can collapse back into chaos, seems a powerful idea involving water, even for people who don't experience floods. On the other hand, it also needs to be said that flood stories can't be terminal, or else nobody would survive to tell about them. What goes back to the primal waters is almost always in these stories reborn, and creation starts all over again. The Christian ceremony of baptism uses this same imagery. A sinful person is submerged into the water and then reborn as a new creature, and that's pretty much the way flood stories work. There were hints of that even in the earth diver myths that we looked at last time, in which an animal dives down to the bottom of the water and brings up a bit of mud with which a new earth is created. Some of the oldest flood stories in the world come from Mesopotamia, which was a place that knew about catastrophic floods. The Nile was a fairly predictable river and fairly modest in the way that it behaved. In fact, it was so predictable that the Egyptians could read certain stars when they arose in the sky, meant the flood was on the way. The Tigris and Euphrates were far from predictable or modest or domesticated. Sometimes there wasn't enough water, and sometimes there was so much water that it must have looked as though the entire world was covered with it. Archaeologists have found evidence where inches of new silt were laid down by a single flood, which would have wiped away irrigation canals and boundary markers, and you would have to start all over again once the flood had receded. One of the oldest Mesopotamian flood stories is one called Atrahasis. It's one of the oldest flood stories in the world. It's probably Sumerian. Again, it goes back to those first people who lived in this area, but it exists only in a later Babylonian version dating from about 1700 BCE. There's no complete version of this, and so scholars have had to sort of piece it together from bits and pieces here and there, but a general summary is at least possible. The poem actually begins before the creation of humankind. Anu is the god, the chief god, and is the ruler of the sky. Enlil is the god of earth, and Ea, whom we've met before in our Babylonian creation story, is the god of waters. Enlil, in order to cultivate the earth, has assigned a group of lesser gods to be sort of worker gods. They are responsible for planting, for irrigation, for maintaining the irrigation canals, for doing all of the really hard work that goes into agriculture. And they do this for many years until one day they just get fed up with it and they throw down their tools. In some cases, they even burn them. And then they form a kind of picket line outside of Enlil's palace. Enlil is aghast. He says, I don't know what to do about this, and he actually wants to flee to heaven to join Anu. But it's Ea who comes to the rescue again, as he does in so many of these stories. And he talks a goddess, Nintu, into making human beings to do the work that the gods don't want to do. She creates 7 males and 7 females and sets them down and allows them to multiply, and the crisis all seems to have passed. But humans continue to multiply at an alarming rate, and Enlil eventually has trouble sleeping or thinking or paying attention because of all the noise. He lives on Earth, after all. So he tries various ways to diminish population. He does some of them subtly, some of them not so subtle. He sends plagues to try to wipe some of them out. He sends droughts. But each time he does, Ea figures out some way of rescuing humans and foils his plans. Finally, Enlil comes up with what he thinks has got to be a foolproof plan. He will destroy human beings with a flood, which he will require Ea, as god of the waters, to provide. And in addition, he swears all of the gods to secrecy about the plan so that humans will not find out this is going to happen. Ea manages to get around his vow by warning the good king Atrahasis, not directly, not telling him directly, but he divulges the plans to the king's house, and then he empowers the walls to speak to the king. So when the king starts hearing his walls talking to him, he listens. He is given instructions for an ark which allows him to ride out the 7-day flood, and he takes with him his wife, his family, some craftsmen, some grain, some manufactured goods, and they all survive the flood. When the flood has passed, he emerges from his ark and gives a thank offering to the gods. Enlil is initially furious that somebody managed to save this group, but the other gods talk him into remembering the values of human labor and having some humans around to do this work, so he eventually relents. He wins some concessions about population control, however. He still was worried about what happens when overpopulation occurs. So he's given a class of priestesses who are forbidden to bear children, and he is allowed to have many more stillbirths and miscarriages and abortions, and many, many infants who will die young. The human race will survive here, but at a cost, because now there are population controls that are built into it. Atrahasis, on the other hand, the one who built the ark, is rewarded with eternal life for his part in saving humanity. The poem is ideological, I guess, in that it counts for classes of barren priestesses and the high rate of infant mortality. And it also reminds us that we have to value those classes because their existence limits population enough to keep Enlil from sending another flood. That's one of the really oldest flood stories in the world. A more famous one from Mesopotamia, again, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Like Atrahasis, this is probably Sumerian in origin. Our best copy comes from a 7th century BCE Assyrian library. This one is about a king of Uruk, Gilgamesh, who thinks that he has figured out a way of defeating mortality. He and his good friend Enkidu have done such a series of heroic adventures, have accomplished so much, that they have names that will live on long, long, long after their death, and this he considers to be sufficient immortality. But then Enkidu, his friend, becomes ill and dies slowly and painfully of what's called a wasting sickness. Gilgamesh tends Enkidu throughout his long illness and then finally holds him in his arms when Enkidu dies. And the poem says, holds him in his arms long after he has died until, as the poem says, the worm fastens on him. What happens to Gilgamesh now is that all of his hopes about how to defeat mortality have just been dashed because that physical experience, seeing what it is that death really does, how it looks, terrifies him. And so what he does is he decides to go on a personal quest for immortality. He strips off his kingly regalia, he dresses himself as a pilgrim, and he heads off on his pilgrimage looking for immortality, and this makes up the last 1/3 of the poem. There are a lot of adventures in this last third of the poem, which we don't really have time for, but where he eventually winds up is on the island of Utnapishtim, who in this poem was the one who survived the flood, along with his wife and family, of course. Since he presumably has the secret of eternal life, he was given eternal life for his part in the flood story, and since he is immortal, Gilgamesh figures if I can just find him and ask him, maybe he can teach me how to do it too. It's the goal of his quest. Utnapishtim, when Gilgamesh gets there, assures him that his own immortality was a one-time deal. It cannot be repeated. It was a gift of the gods. But while Gilgamesh is there, he tells him the story of the flood. The story is very like that we have in the Atrahasis. Enlil gets irritated, decides to wipe out humanity, takes an oath of secrecy from all the gods, which Ea gets around once again, this time by divulging the plans to the house of Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim learns it from the walls. In his ark, Utnapishtim takes along as many living things as it will hold, family and friends and animals and craftsmen. And there's a really interesting detail in the story that kind of a little bit of Sumerian irony, I guess, that when his neighbors say to Utnapishtim, what are you doing? Why are you building this huge ark? He says that he is in bad odor with Enlil, who's after him, and so he's going to take a little trip down to the Gulf for the time being. But he says, in the meantime, while I'm gone, he said, since I will be gone and I'm the one that Enlil dislikes, he said, expect some really heavy blessings to fall from the sky. I guess that's kind of Sumerian irony because it's not quite blessings that they're going to get. The ark that he builds manages to ride out the 7-day flood. The 7 days are horrifying in their scale, and even the gods are frightened and run away to heaven to hide away, thinking that they're going to be destroyed by this flood. When the storm finally subsides, the ark rests on the last mountaintop sticking up out of the water. After 7 more days, he sends out a dove who returns, and then later sends out a raven who doesn't return. That is, the raven found some kind of resting place. He throws open the ark and offers a sacrifice to the gods. As in the first story, Enlil is again angry, but Ea again talks him out of his anger, and Enlil relents. He blesses Utnapishtim and his wife and gives them immortality, that immortality that Gilgamesh has come to seek. This is a kind of etiological myth also. If it doesn't explain exactly why human beings have to die, it does explain that humans have to die. Gilgamesh comes back from his quest empty-handed. His quest has failed. And he realizes at the end of the poem that his own immortality, such as it is, has to depend on the achievements of mortal life because there is no escape from death. There's one really touching moment in the poem when he comes to the edge of the ocean of death that he has to cross to get to the island where Utnapishtim lives. He meets a goddess named Siduri who says to him, what are you doing? What are you looking for? And he says, I am frightened of death because of what happened to my friend Enkidu, and I'm looking for immortality. She answers him in this way. What she says is, you will never find that life for which you are looking. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, fill your belly with good things. Day and night and day, dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water, cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace, for this, too, is the lot of man. It's interesting, at that point of the poem, Gilgamesh turns down that advice because he's looking for something else. He's looking for more. He's looking really for immortality. But the poem as a whole suggests that this is perhaps what we have to settle for. And that's perhaps one of the points of the poem. Anyway, that's the flood story as it comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Probably the most famous story in our part of the world is the story that comes from Genesis of Noah's Ark. there are many people who know the Noah's Ark story who've never opened a Bible, so this has gotten into popular consciousness in a lot of ways. It probably derives from Mesopotamian versions. The Hebrews had come from Mesopotamia, and the kind of flood that's described in the Mesopotamian stories or in Noah's Ark story doesn't actually happen in Canaan, the land in which the Hebrews settled. So it's perhaps possible that like the Native Americans who may have brought earth diver memories with them from Asia, it's possible that the Hebrews here carried memories of this kind of flood story with them when they traveled into their promised land. Like the Mesopotamian versions that we just looked at, the story in Genesis is both an end and a beginning. It ends the first creation, but it ends with a new covenant made between God and humans in which God accepts the imperfections of humans and promises never to destroy them, at least not in that way again. The story begins in a very odd way, and this is one of those little details that nobody has ever quite figured out how to deal with. The story begins with a mention of the sons of God who take wives from the daughters of men. God gets worried by this. We're not quite sure who these sons of God are, but they must be angelic or semi-divine beings of some sort. And their taking wives from mortal women seems to worry God. We're not sure again why, because it's not really explained very much, but there's a hint here of that same kind of story that we have run across before, the one we ran across in the Maya story, in which the gods made humans a little too good and had to scale them back. There's a comparable kind of story in the Old Testament itself, in the story of the Tower of Babel. Here the implication is that if sons of God marry mortal women, the human children born from them are going to be some pretty extraordinary people. And in fact, the text says they were giants and mighty men. God seems to think that perhaps this is bringing humankind a little too close to the level of gods. And so what he does here is he limits human lifespan to 120 years. Says that's all the longer you can live. Presumably, 120 years wouldn't be enough time for us, even if we are half divine, to figure out how to consolidate, to use our powers. And so this part of the story, whether it has anything really to do with the flood story or not, we're not sure, but that's the way the flood story really begins, with this odd mention of these sons of God mating with the daughters of men. Then God sees the wickedness of men and sees that it has become very great. The thoughts of their heart, he said, are entirely wicked. It grieves him, and he repents of ever having created humans in the cosmos in the first place. He decides, just as Enlil does in the Mesopotamian accounts, to wipe everything out, to pretend it never happened. We have a question for us is whether this has anything to do with those semi-divine giants of the preceding section. Maybe they are the source of the wickedness that grieves God, or, as other people have said, this has nothing to do with the flood story. It's just a piece of unassimilated folklore which sneaked into this story and has nothing to do with the story itself. Human wickedness seems enough on its own to explain the motive for the flood. And anyway, the giants and mighty men are not described as wicked, and they are not mentioned again in the flood story. Anyway, Noah turns out, we are told, to be a just man who walked with God. So God tells him about the impending flood and tells him how to build an ark. He even gives him the exact dimensions for it. Then he says he will make a covenant with Noah and his family. Noah's end of the contract is, after building the ark, he will take into it a pair of every living thing, birds, cattle, creeping things, and enough food to last for a very long time. This is all in chapter 6 of Genesis. Then chapter 7 backtracks a little bit and adds a couple of confusing details. Here, Noah is told to take into the ark 7 pairs of clean animals, that is, those animals that are approved by Jewish dietary laws, and 1 pair of each unclean animal. It may be that we have, again here, 2 stories being conflated, as we had in the Genesis creation stories. Thury and Davini, in their introduction to mythology, actually go through this entire flood story line by line, verse by verse, trying to sort out the places from which each detail came. And that's a good place to look it up if you're interested, to see how complex the threads are that makes up this story. When everyone is aboard, everything is aboard, God himself, according to the story, shuts up the ark, and then he opens up the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven, and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. As the text has it, And every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. The waters, after the rain stops, after the flood stops, the waters prevail for another 150 days, making this a real return to conditions before the creation. And it seems a universal flood too, not just one in a particular region, but covering the entire earth. The ark eventually comes to rest on a mountaintop that emerges from this watery mass. After 40 more days, Noah opens the ark and he sends out a raven. Then he sends out a dove. The dove comes back. 7 days later, he sends her out again, and this time she returns famously with an olive branch in her mouth, suggesting that some of the tops of trees are beginning to show above the water. 7 days later, he sends her out one more time, and this time she doesn't return. She has found a place to roost. Then he, like Atrahasis, like Utnapishtim, throws open the ark and releases all the creatures, and like his predecessors from Mesopotamia, he offers a sacrifice which pleases God. We are told the Lord smelt a sweet savor. God promises not to curse the ground anymore for man's sake. Because God realizes here, and this is a real concession on God's part, he now realizes, as he puts it, that the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. And so he says, neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. That is, God says creation hasn't turned out the way he wanted it to, but now he will make some allowances. He'll accept humans for what they are, and he won't demand from them an impossibly high level of purity. This is a new creation, but it's one, interestingly, with lowered expectations. God isn't going to expect quite what he did from his first order of creation. Noah and his wife then are given certain new kinds of instructions and certain new kinds of privileges as they move into this new world. They are charged to breed. They have to repopulate the earth with this little group of people who has survived. God gives them, as one of his concessions, the right to eat meat and therefore to kill animals and fish. This is new. In the Genesis account, humans were only given permission to be vegetarians, so that become meat eaters and fish eaters now is a new detail in this story. He does, however, while he's giving this concession, reissue his commandment against killing human beings, fellow human beings, because, as he reminds them, human beings are always created in the image of God. He also promises never, ever, ever to destroy earth again by flood, and he hangs his weapon of war, his bow, he hangs it in the sky as a sign of his promise. History begins again at this moment with slightly altered rules. Thury and Davini, again, have in their book have a page which is dedicated to the differences between the Mesopotamian versions of the flood story and the Hebrew accounts of the flood story, this one. As we've noted before, in Mesopotamia, human beings were created as servants to do work that the gods don't want to do themselves. But Genesis has always given, at least in the first creation account, has given humans credit for being the crown of creation, the reason for which everything else is created. So in the Mesopotamian version, the covenant is made only with Atrahasis or with Utnapishtim. It doesn't have any implications for other people, as Gilgamesh finds out. God's covenant in Genesis is made with all people, and animals too. At least for humans, there is an element of forgiveness in this new covenant. God lowers his expectations. All he wants from here on is observance of dietary laws and not to kill each other. In exchange, he grants a kind of perpetual hostility between humans and animals. Humans from now on will be able to kill animals and eat them. And he promises, on his side of the bargain, never ever to lose his temper in this way again. He also takes off some of the curse that he'd put on the ground for Adam's transgression and for Cain's. In both of these stories, both when he throws Adam and Eve out of the garden and when Cain has killed his brother Abel, he puts huge and awful curses on the soil. When Adam is thrown out of the garden, he says, "Cursed be the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life." And when he drives Cain out into a life of wandering, he says, "When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth." Now he says to Noah, taking back some of those curses that he had put on the earth earlier. He says, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So agriculture gets a new lease here. It's going to be a little easier. It's still not going to be easy, but it's going to be easier than it was. So the flood wasn't just an ending, but the flood is also a beginning. A reimmersion in the primal waters has allowed Earth to reemerge in a new kind of way. There's another really interesting detail of this story. When Noah was initially born in the account in Genesis, his father Lamech says about this infant who's just been born, he says, this same, that is this baby, this same shall comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. That is, he said, this young child, this infant, is going to do something to ameliorate a little bit the work we have to put in because of the way God has cursed the ground. Then after the flood, we are told that Noah becomes an husbandman and he plants a vineyard. It makes him sound like he perhaps is the inventor of wine. In the next verse, this is sort of confirmed by when we are told that after the first harvest, he drinks of the wine and was drunken. S.G.F. Brandon, in his book called Creation Legends of the Ancient Near East, says that this looks like a bit of, like fragments of, a type of story which he calls the Heilbringer story, or the salvation bringer. Here, the story would concern the mitigation of the hard lot of agriculture by the creation of wine, because wine does ease our burdens a bit. It does make glad the hearts of men. It explains both Lamech's prophecy that this young baby is going to do something to mitigate the toil of agriculture, and the fact that immediately after the floods, he plants a vineyard. That Heilbringer story, if in fact that's what it is, gets derailed and blunted a little bit in the rest of the telling, because after Noah gets drunk, we're told that he falls down in such a way that he lies exposed, and he's discovered in that condition by Ham. And of course, this is really taboo, to look upon the nakedness of your father. And so Ham goes out and tells his brothers, who do the right thing. They put some cloth behind them and they back into their father, and then they drop the cloth over him before they turn around, so they have not in fact looked on the nakedness of their father. The writer kind of goes off at this point on this curse that's dropped on Ham for having seen the nakedness of his father, and on the blessings that are given to Shem and Japheth for having done the right thing. So we actually never quite get the follow-through on this Heilbringer story, if that's what it is. But it's possible in the context of this story that this is another of God's gifts to humans in concession to their hard lot. He promises not to send another flood. He takes the curse off the ground. He allows humans to eat meat and perhaps gives them wine as a palliative. This is, in fact, one of the rather more handsome pictures of God in the Old Testament. And he does all of this in spite of how disappointed he is in the way humans turn out. So this turns out to be a real recreation story with a new and different world reemerging from the chaos of the Great Flood. And this is the way flood stories generally work. Most of the most famous flood stories in history are usually not just about endings, but also about beginnings. Most flood stories can be seen, in fact, as critics have noted, as kind of productive sacrifices, which lead to a rebirth of all of life. And flood stories have personal as well as cosmic implications. All purification by water ceremonies are microcosmic versions of the Great Deluge. As we mentioned before, baptized sinners in the Christian rite is immersed in the flood and then dies to the old life and reemerges to the new. In the hero myths that we'll look at in Unit 3, the hero descends to the underworld to confront death and then reemerges, reborn in a way that has overcome the destructive powers of chaos, just as the world does in the flood myths, and as the baptized Christian does, and as that little toad does who dives down to the bottom to bring up a piece of mud. In psychological terms, using our psychological term, and we'll talk more about this later in Unit 3, the flood myth is about submerging oneself in one's own unconscious, in the chaotic primeval waters of the self, in order to be reborn into the achievement of maturity and individuation. Well, We have a couple of more flood stories we're going to do. Next time we'll take a look at a Greco-Roman one from Ovid's Metamorphosis. We'll look at several of them from China, one from India, and then one particularly harrowing version of the flood story from the Aztecs, and then we'll try to consolidate what we've done with flood stories so far. That's next time.